Going to be doing today, as you know from the blurb which went out on the internet and all the various social media stuff, is talking about TBLT and BELF, and hopefully everybody has had a chance to remind themselves of what we mean by TBLT and what we mean by BELF. If not, it doesn't matter. I'll be covering that in the first half hour. So we'll have a session where I do the talking for the first half hour. After that, we'll go into our break room, and those of us who come here regularly in this group know what the system is. We go into small groups, we talk about various things. In this case, I'll suggest some things to talk about, and then after about half an hour, 40 minutes, we all come back in together and spend the last 20 minutes or so sharing ideas, summarizing what each group has talked about, and just having a conversation. And that's what this is all about, as Helen said. This is very much a conversation. It's not about somebody lecturing and everybody else taking notes. So what I'm going to do is talk about TBLT and BELF, and I'll start by talking about TBLT, and I'm sure a lot of what I'm going to be talking about will be very familiar to you, especially if you work in business English, which is, of course, the context we're all working in, I hope. And we'll start by looking at a typical course book. This is a course book I was involved in writing about 100 years ago, and it's aimed at the construction industry. And if we look at this two-page spread, it's very similar to many course books. We start that it has a topic, documentation. So we're talking about documents and how people organize documentation in the company. And we do things like we brainstorm types of documents, and then maybe we'll have some listening activity where we listen to something and pick out names of documents. Then we listen again and have some questions about what was in the listening text. And then maybe we'll have another exercise where we look at some documents and try and identify which sort of document they are within this context. We'll move on to do some vocabulary exercises, controlled exercises like fill in the gaps or close exercises like this, or listening and filling in what you've heard again. So you've listened to the language, it's been presented, now you're practicing it a little bit. And then finally, we'll maybe talk about the language structures, the grammar of what we've been looking at, have some more controlled practice, and then end up with some sort of exercise, some sort of task. In this case, design a simple log sheet for tagging documents. So you're asking people to do something, and you're hoping that the language they uses the structures and the vocabulary and so on, the language that has just been given to them in the first part of the session. We call this PPP. I'm sure we're all very familiar with this idea. We present the language, we practice the language in some sort of controlled way, and then we produce the language very often in the form of some sort of task. But as we will see, this word task is, in a sense, problematic because it means so many different things to so many different people. So let's start by this definition. This is a general ELT definition. Penny is probably well known to a lot of the people in the room. What is a task? It's a learner activity with two objectives: learning some aspect of the language and an outcome which can be discussed or evaluated. It could be a grammar exercise, a problem-solving activity, a writing assignment, and so on. So basically what she's talking about is using the word task to denote pretty much every activity that happens in a classroom. This is actually quite different to what we talk about tasks in the sense of task-based language teaching, language learning. So if we look at some other definitions, Jane Willis, who I will admit now I studied with, she supervised my master's degree, so I learned quite a lot about task-based learning from her. A goal-oriented activity with a specific outcome where the emphasis is on exchanging meanings, not producing specific language forms. So you can see in this type of thinking, this type of definition of task, it's not to do with the linguistic forms, it's not the focus on the grammar structures and so on. It's all about exchanging meaning and doing communication. Another very common definition at the bottom, a task is an activity which requires learners to use language with emphasis on meaning to attain an objective. So you can see this is a bit different to the Penny definition of task, which is pretty much anything that happens in the language classroom. And then we go on to what might be called a stronger definition of task. This is Mike Long, who, if you know anything about TBLT, you will have read at least some of his work. And he has a much stronger perception, much stronger understanding of what TBLT is. And for Mike Long, TBLT starts with a task-based needs analysis. Needs analysis didn't come in to the other definitions because they have to do with classroom tasks which are used to practice something using meaning over form. But here, the tasks are based on a needs analysis. He talks about target tasks for a particular group of learners. So we're getting much more specific, much more business English-like. Task in TBLT has its normal technical meaning. Tasks are real-world activities people think of when planning, conducting, or recording their day. So for him, task-based learning is all about using these real-world tasks. And those real-world tasks can only be done if you have the chance to do a thorough needs analysis and you can understand what the tasks are of your target group. Already we can start seeing problems with this because, of course, it's sometimes quite tricky to do a formal needs analysis. So what we're talking about with task-based learning in that definition is this sort of thing. You identify a task. People who know me know that I work in maritime industry, so I'll have a couple of examples from maritime today. So here are two officers bringing their ship into a harbor, bringing their vessel into a harbor, and the task is what's the communication going on between them, how to do it. And of course, after the task, the teacher may give feedback on the language that's used. And there's also task feedback that might come from the teacher. More often than not, it comes from the other people in the room, the experts, the peers, the peers of the people doing the language task. So if it's a presentation, for example, the other people in the room from the same company might give completely different feedback on the task compared to the teacher who's probably focusing more on language. Of course, it depends. Many teachers work in companies full time and have a very good understanding of the local context. Now, this idea of task depends on trying to reflect this real world. In this picture, for example, these two young officers are sitting in a simulator. They're not in a real vessel. And of course, the simulator is fantastic. And English teachers would love to do their classes in there because to do the tasks, you need to have access to all the machines and all the information these guys are getting during the task. But of course, the simulator costs something like $1 million an hour to run. So English teachers normally don't get access to the simulator to do their English lessons. And already, again, we begin to see the limitations of this word real world task when we take it into the language of the workplace. It's very easy to say, let's bring the real world into the classroom. But as soon as you're in the classroom, you're no longer in the real world with all its technology, input, and all the rest of it. I'm going to play a short recording. This is only a very short recording, just to give you an idea of how this is different really to the coursebook type tasks, which we looked at the beginning. This is a recording. I had a group of South Korean maritime officers, and it was early on in the course. This was a leadership course. This was not a language course, but they were sharing experiences, and we recorded people giving 10, 15-minute talks to the rest of the group. This was all online, sharing experiences. And this chap, who was a junior officer on a VLC, a bulk carrier, is going to tell us, or tell the people in the group about a collision that he was involved in. Now, as I play this, listen to this. It's not going to be easy to understand, I suspect, because it is somebody from South Korea speaking English. And of course, there's a lot of technical words. I've put the list of technical words there, so you'll hear them as he says them, hopefully. But as we listen to it, just think about how real world this is, how useful it is as a language learning opportunity.
This is the first time, and it is a collision accident. In 2020, last year, I bought VLOC bulk carrier, bulk work carrier. I anchored in PDM in Brazil. I anchored about 20 days, for 20 days. And when I carry out duty in the morning around 7 o'clock, I found one vessel approaching to me. So I gave warning signal by press on. I said, that vessel, please don't approach to my vessel. The distance between my vessel and your vessel is very close. So please keep clear of me. So I said.
So that's a typical real world, or quite close to the real world task that we might have in a language lesson in a business English or in a workplace context. And as you can see, there are some issues with it. First of all, for the teacher especially, you've got to know about the context. If you're going to give language feedback, you've got to understand the accent. You've got to understand the technical jargon and so on. And of course, as soon as you do real world business English, I'm not talking about business English with pre-experience here, I'm talking about people in real jobs. This is very typical of the sort of thing that you'll hear. One of the issues with this, which comes across quite strongly in task-based learning as well, is the idea of a monolingual group. You may have problems understanding what he's talking about, even if you were an expert in maritime, because of the accent. But of course, this group was all South Koreans. I have been working with them for some time. I do quite a lot of work in South Korea. And so the accent and the way of using language was quite familiar to us. And so the communicative outcome, if it's successful or not, depends really on our ability to understand that. And this is another one of the problems of task-based learning. How do we know how successful this is if it's with other people who are not in the class? This sounded perfectly good to me. I could understand everything. We had wonderful discussions afterwards, him, the rest of the class and me. Everybody shared their experiences and ideas. But how much would that be transferable to a context, which is actually what these people are aiming to do, which is get work in other shipping lines outside South Korea? That was the whole point of the course. I'll play another one. This is now a Russian lady I was working with, much lower level, and she's just talking about putting her team together. And again, as we go through it, just think about some of the issues here.
A product owner or product owner team, we have people, they have only business background, only IT background, and only controlling background. Project management, budget, milestones, stakeholder, and sometimes one people have all skills, and sometimes we need 2 or 3 people for 3 skills. This is our very different for discussion.
For discussions, yes.
For discussions and for one goal.
Yes. Okay. So the team will have technical people, you said, controllers or the project management. And what's the third one?
Business.
Sales, marketing.
Yes. For example, we will build. We will custom. We kaufen. We bought.
We buy.
We buy one.
Okay. Here the situation is quite different. This is not her talking to a group of peers. This is a one-to-one online session, similar to one I suspect most of the people in this room have with their own students, their own learners. And my role is partly to communicate, to understand what she's saying. So I have questions to try and clarify what's going on. But I'm also doing other things in this conversation, like helping her with the language. Now, of course, that happens in real lingua franca conversations. Of course it does. But maybe I'm doing it a bit differently. The point is that even though we're two people trying to understand the situation, and one is transferring information about the situation to me so I can understand the context, our relationship is still learner and teacher. It's not two equals. I'm not a business person from outside. I'm not one of her colleagues. I have a relationship with her as her teacher. And so some of the things and the way we react and the way we behave and the way we talk depends on that relationship. So how real world is it? Is one of the questions. However, what I would like to argue is that these two conversations you've heard, and I'm sure all of us have thousands of examples like this, are much more like real communication compared to what was going on in the course book. And of course, much more personalized. This is not somebody coming in and saying, this is the language, this is what you're going to talk about, etc. This is much more, tell me a story, and then whatever comes from them. So this is a very different type of learning situation to the course book type of situation. And when we look at the literature on task-based language learning, and if you have looked at the literature, you'll see there's so much discussion, so many opinions. Depends on who you rate, will depend on your understanding of task-based learning. It's certainly not a thing which everybody has the same understanding about. But very often people do agree that there's a weak version of TBLT and a strong version of TBLT. And the weak version of TBLT, as I put here, is the sort of thing that happens when we're using a course book as our main framework for a course. So we've got language, which is predetermined. The teacher or the course book writer has decided. We've got a focus on the linguistic items, but it's proactive. In other words, it's not reacting to people's problems. It's the teacher or the situation or the syllabus deciding what linguistic items are being focused on. Peter Skahan famously calls this structure trapping exercises, where the idea is to create tasks or activities which force you to use the structures which are being taught, being covered. Of course, it's teacher-centered. It's either course book writer-centered or teacher, but it's not the learner making decisions about what language is used. Some people call this task-supported language teaching or language learning as opposed to task-based language teaching. It's basically learning by explicit instruction. Somebody's telling you what's right and what's wrong. And the success of those activities always depends on linguistic correctness. It doesn't depend on how well you communicate. If we look at the other sort, the stronger version of TBLT, which is the last two examples I showed, you could argue it's actually quite different. It's learner-centered, not teacher-centered. Everything in the communication comes from the learner. Needs analysis is crucial in understanding or setting up the task on the teacher's side so that the learner can do this learner-centered work. It's incidental learning. You learn in a completely different way. The idea is that you learn language because it's there, it's floating around in the air, there's exposure to the language, and somehow you learn it. But it's not pre-decided, it's not predetermined, it's not somebody says these are the 10 words you're going to learn in this exercise. Success, of course, is quite different. It's not based on linguistic correctness. It doesn't matter if you make any mistakes. It doesn't actually matter if you use other languages like the lady did. It totally depends on the communicative outcome. And in both those situations, I was able to, in that situation, understand what they were saying and have a conversation with them about their topic. The language is emergent. It's not predetermined. The focus on the linguistic items very much in task-based learning comes after the task, and that's where the teacher comes in, or the others in the room, and give feedback on what was said. Sometimes there's a recording of, say, competent speakers doing exactly the same task for people to listen to and focus and notice language items and so on. But it comes afterwards, it's not before. The idea is it's real-world tasks as much as possible. I'm not sure personally we ever get to real-world tasks, but you can see it's quite a different idea to the weak version of task-based language teaching. When we have our discussion later, we'll try and decide where we fit in this and what are the advantages, perhaps, and disadvantages of each one. Do any of us do one or the other, or are we hovering in the middle? Are we changing depending on the teaching context, and so on? Now, when we look at this in terms of business English teaching, there's a little bit of research, not a lot. A lot of the reading on task-based language learning and language teaching comes from people who are working in universities. They're certainly not working in companies. But Stephen Evans did do some work on this. He's working in university, but he focused on business English teaching a lot. And this is one of his articles, which I strongly recommend you read, Designing Tasks for the Business English Classroom. And he talks about various approaches, and in part of in the conclusion, he says such an approach essentially corresponds to the strong version of task-based language teaching. So what he's recommending is the strong version, that is using language to communicate in situations where the meanings are unpredictable. And I love this word unpredictable. That's, for me, is the big difference between the coursebook one, where the teacher pretty much knows what's going to happen, and the other one where you're reacting. TBLT, with its emphasis on purposeful communication and skill integration, seems especially well suited to the teaching of business English. And various people in the business English teaching world have argued for TBLT in a stronger version. But of course, the reality is that it's not really that simple when we get to the real world. And I'll give you one example. Years and years and years ago, in the 90s, I was working I was embedded. So I was full-time trainer in a big factory that made power plants. So I knew the topic. I was well versed. I'd been there a couple of years. I knew people in it. And I set a task up, which was based on information from expert insiders, so people in the company. And I built this task to make it as real world as possible. It wasn't this drawing. It was technical drawings from a project they were doing. And I gave them this technical project to solve. And there were a couple of engineers. They came in and I said, okay, today we're going to do this task. Here's the problem. Here's the drawings. Can you do the task? And they looked at me and smiled. They then pulled out their calculators. They started pointing at things, going, okay, yeah, 20 minutes later, they had completed the task successfully. The outcome was perfectly successful, and they hadn't used one word of English or German or anything. So this is one of the problems of this idea that measuring success is based on the outcome. What we're trying to do in a language teaching context is much more than a successful task. We are trying to teach language. And so this is one of the issues. People need to have a reason to use English, not language, not their own language necessarily, but use English in order to communicate. Otherwise, you're not really doing a very good job as an English teacher, perhaps. And there are lots of issues. I mean, when you start reading what people have written about this is a few of the things which I've come up with from my own experience or from my reading. First of all, there are practical implementation issues. It's all very well saying it's based on a needs analysis, but I know from previous experience chatting to people in this room and many, many years of working with business English teachers worldwide, the reality of doing a proper needs analysis where you go into companies, where you sit down, you watch meetings, you observe meetings, you learn about what's going on, or, you know, if like Anne, you're in aviation, you know, going in and listening to real conversations, recording them, analyzing them, discussing them with real expert insiders and so on. In other words, doing a proper formal needs analysis is actually quite rare. And so we've always got this compromise, I think. Preparation time, it takes time to do all this. Task design, how difficult, how easy, how do you decide if something's difficult or easy, and so on. How do we measure success? When we move from COP to COP, community of practice to community of practice, what counts as good communication in one might count as very poor communication in another. It's very difficult for us, without knowing the community of practice, to actually make any sort of decision about what is successful communication. Teachers need to have a certain amount of expertise. Course books, in a way, cradle a teacher, especially at the beginning of their career. But if you're only relying on a stronger version of TBLT, you've got to be able to react and give the right feedback. You've got to be able to manage the task and all sorts of skills which you might not have early on in your career. Stakeholders might have different expectations. Your boss in the school or your boss in the HR department or whoever you're working, whoever's paying for the training might say, look, I want to know what you're going to do before you do it. And they might not be very happy with a course which is designed on emergent language. And I can't tell you what we're going to do, but I'll tell you in 6 months' time what we've done. You know, you might not get the contract. There's always the hegemony of course books and tests. People are given these things. Tests very often decide what's happening in a course. Another one of the criticisms is this problem with input. If we don't know what the input is in these tasks, and we can't identify it beforehand, how do we know if we're doing the right thing? Are we wasting time? Or like my, power plant people? It's very difficult to do it without pinning down, without knowing what's going to happen. And then for me, I think a big problem, and this has been often discussed for the last 10, 15 years, this whole idea of weird research. So much of the research we're looking at in our industry is based on people who are based in the English-speaking countries, or perhaps they're not native speakers from Britain or America, but they're living and working there. And of course, there's a certain bias in all this research. How much research are we seeing from different countries, different places, who look at things in completely different ways, perhaps? We might ask somebody from China to write a research article, but we'll expect them to do it in our format, our genre, looking at it in one of our journals, and so on. And this is problematic, I think. And then for me, one of the big problems is a lot of the research doesn't really take the business English practitioner into account. There's so much going on in companies, in L&D, learning and development, in HR. And so when you're working in companies, when you're doing business English in this sort of context, you're working in a context, in a training context. And understanding how that affects what you do in the classroom is very, very important. And it's almost doesn't exist that you see ELT research, which is based on stuff like this. Occasionally, the odd university professor or the university lecturer will go into a company for a few weeks, or they'll do a case study or something, come out back into the university world. But that's what I'm talking about. If you're working inside companies for 30 years, it's a very different perspective to if you're in a university popping in and out. Okay, so that's TBLT in a nutshell. I'm going to very quickly run through BELF. This is a group which discusses BELF regularly. This is our 20th anniversary, I think. So a lot of these concepts will not be new to people, hopefully, or you'll have looked at our website beforehand and seen some of the what we mean by BELF. But I'm just going to run through a couple of the definitions very quickly. First of all, what is BELF? BELF is the use of English as a medium of communication among speakers of different first languages. So it could be native speakers and non-native speakers, to use wonderful terms, but it's emergent, it's variable, it's hybrid. And already you can start hearing words like emergent, which we've already talked about in task-based learning, especially in the strong version of it. Specific business context, again, all based on real-world needs analysis. So there's a crossover between BELF and TBLT. Here's another one. BELF, enabling resource to get the work done. Very famous definition. Highly context-bound, situation-specific, moving target, defined, detailed linguistic description. Again, it's not all about getting the correctness in terms of linguistic forms. It's about getting the meaning across. Alessia, who I know is in the room. Hi, Alessia. BELF communication is intrinsically intercultural. And this is very well understood in business English. I mean, even in course books now, I don't think you could find a course book which doesn't have quite a lot of intercultural input, and we're all very familiar with all sorts of activities, critical incidents, awareness activities, and so on, awareness raising activities. So this is part and parcel of BELF. Now, in the task-based learning literature, you very rarely see anything to do with intercultural communication. But it doesn't really matter, because as soon as you do a needs analysis and you're realizing that you're supposed to be simulating or replicating real-world tasks, and since real-world use of English for our learners is intercultural communication, it is part and parcel of TBLT, even though it's not really discussed, I would argue. Is it possible in a monolingual class, though? I think this is a real problem when we're trying to prepare people to work in different cultures, corporate cultures, national cultures, whatever sort of culture we mean. But if all our people in one class, in one room, come from the same culture, then that in itself raises training issues, teaching issues, which we need to work to resolve. And of course, we can do it nowadays, especially with technology. It's very easy to put people in touch with people from different countries and different companies, but not always. ELF and BELF research has a lot to say on the testing and assessment, especially Jennifer Jenkins. I can see Alessia smiling. ELF communication is so diverse and variable that it makes no sense to focus on any specific forms. In other words, the only thing that is testable is the outcome. And we know, looking at articles, for example, on TOEIC, which is the biggest business English test in the world, that very often people pass these exams and are unable to use English in the real world because they haven't this criteria for success is not real world communication, but it's some sort of compromise of real world, something that can be tested rather than somebody that is actually replicates the real world. And my last point, ELF is very much multilingual. In the early days of ELF research, this wasn't really a big thing. People were trying to understand other issues, what forms make, what types of language were used in ELF. But very soon the researchers found that it is multilingual. And even when you think people are speaking English, it's not, it's much more than that. Alessia wrote a very nice article a couple of years ago based on workplace. She's probably one of the big players in BELF, as everybody here knows, I'm sure. But this is an article looking at language use in a transnational workplace. And if we go back to our Russian lady explaining to me all about her team, we can see it's multilingual, and what Alessia calls a covert resource is discutation, where people actually they don't use their own language or another language. What they do is they change words which sound almost English, but they're not English, but they're not something else. They just use their own internal rules and use this. This is very, very common in multilingualism. You can see this in Alessia's article, but here's an example which, you know, I was very happy to see automatically in one short text. And then, of course, there's what Alessia calls the overt resources. So things like code switching, maybe translanguaging. We could discuss if translanguaging and code switching are separate or the same. But the use of words like this is very, very common in ELF and BELF communication. And it happens all the time in the classroom. And it's perhaps not surprising that when we start looking at more recent research into TBLT, translanguaging is now being discussed. There are various articles coming out. This is a recent article, 2024. Given the arguments about L1 use in L2 classroom practice, it is not surprising that translanguaging is emerging as a phenomenon of interest in TBLT. People are now beginning to discuss translanguaging, something which ELF has been discussing for the last 10 years, 15 years, but it's now coming into the TBLT discussions as well, because it's part and parcel of real TBLT, as we've just seen. Okay, that's all I want to say. Just a quick half hour, just giving us some ideas about TBLT, giving us some ideas about what we mean by BELF. The plan now is basically to